History didn't forget Africa by accident. It was rewritten on purpose. When most people hear ancient Africa, they imagine villages, survival, and scarcity. But that picture is false. Long before Europe dominated global trade, African kingdoms controlled wealth systems so advanced that outsiders struggled to understand them. Not just gold, not just land, but power, organization, knowledge, and global influence. Let's tell the part of the story that was quietly removed. Africa's wealth didn't start with Europe arriving. It existed long before contact, built by Africans for Africans. Across West, East, North, and Central Africa, kingdoms rose with economies that were stable, structured, and respected across continents. Gold was one pillar, but not the foundation. The real wealth of African kingdoms came from control of trade routes. Africa sat at the center of the ancient world's most important connections. North Africa linked Europe and the Middle East. West Africa connected goldfields to global markets. East Africa opened directly into the Indian Ocean trade network. Whoever controlled these routes controlled wealth, and African kingdoms controlled them for centuries. Take West Africa. Empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai didn't just mine gold, they regulated it. Gold dust wasn't allowed to circulate freely. Only nuggets were traded by the state. Why? Because controlling supply controlled value. That's economic intelligence most modern nations still struggle with. They taxed trade, protected merchants, and invested in infrastructure. Roads, bus security, storage centers, markets. Merchants from North Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia trusted African markets more than many European ones. Trade was safe, contracts were respected, laws were enforced. That is wealth. But wealth wasn't only measured in gold. In many African societies, land could not be privately stolen or hoarded. It belonged to the community and the state. That meant no mass homelessness, no extreme land inequality, no feudal systems crushing the poor. Food security was a form of wealth. Agricultural systems were advanced. Crop rotation, irrigation, Untold, seasonal planning. Climate knowledge passed through generations. People didn't starve while kings feasted. Stability created prosperity. Now let's talk about something rarely mentioned. Human skill was currency. Blacksmiths, architects, builders, healers, scholars, they were highly valued. In some kingdoms, a master craftsman was worth more than gold. Iron production in Africa was centuries ahead of Europe in many regions. Weapons, tools, farming equipment, all locally produced. That meant economic independence. No reliance on foreign powers. No dependency on imports. That is real wealth. African cities were not villages. They were urban centers. Cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, Kilva, Boretadil, Benin City, had paved streets, organized neighborhoods, trade districts, and administrative systems. Benin City shocked Europeans when they arrived. Wide streets, massive walls, urban planning that exceeded many European cities of the time. European records admit it, then later ignored it. Education was another pillar of wealth. Knowledge is power, and Africa invested heavily in it. Libraries, learning centers, and schools existed across the continent. Timbuktu alone held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Mathematics, bioastronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, Education wasn't limited to royalty. Scholars traveled freely, exchanging ideas across regions. This intellectual wealth threatened later colonial narratives, so it was erased. Religion also played a role in stability. African belief systems emphasized balance. Community over greed. Responsibility over dominance. Wealth as stewardship, not exploitation. Even when Islam and Christianity arrived, African kingdoms adapted them, not replaced their values. That balance prevented endless wars for profit, which brings us to a myth. The idea that African kingdoms were always at war. Yes, armies existed. Yes, wars happened. But constant warfare was not the foundation of wealth. Trade, diplomacy, and alliances were far more profitable. Some kingdoms grew rich precisely because they avoided destructive wars. They understood something many empires didn't. You don't destroy what feeds you. So why don't we learn this version of history? Because when Europe began expanding, it needed a justification. A continent that was wealthy, organized, and intelligent could not be labeled uncivilized. So the narrative changed. Africa became poor. Africa became primitive. Africa became saved, not because it was true, but because it was useful. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Africa didn't lack wealth. Africa lost control of it. Trade routes were seized. Resources were extracted. Systems were dismantled. Knowledge was dismissed. And then Africa was blamed for the outcome. But history is not finished. The same principles that made ancient African kingdoms wealthy still exist. Undis nati escarfil, strategic location. Undre sein, natural resources. Tikusum, human intelligence. Cultural resilience. What was built once can be rebuilt again. The question is no longer whether Africa was rich. The real question is, why were you never told? If this story changed how you see Africa, like the video, share it, and follow for the history they never taught. Because Africa's past is not shameful. It's powerful, and it's time it was remembered.